Every morning for 20 years, Augustus Maddox had watched the sunrise alone from his New Mexico ranch porch, the silence heavy with memories of his late wife Martha. At 73, the wealthy cattleman believed his best days were behind him, nothing left but regret and the echo of boots that once walked these halls with purpose. Then, a baby eagle started visiting his porch. Day after day, the small bird would land on his rail and stare at him with eyes that seemed to know something he didn't. Most folks would have ignored her, but Gus felt drawn to follow when she took flight each morning. The eagle would circle back, waiting, as if she had something important to show him. What she eventually led him to in the deep canyon shadows would change everything he thought he knew about his past. What secret had been waiting all these years? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The red mesas stretched endlessly beyond the wraparound porch of the Maddox ranch house, their ancient faces catching the morning light like weathered sentinels standing guard over secrets older than memory. Gus adjusted his position in the heavy oak chair, the same chair where Martha used to sit with her morning coffee, reading him snippets from the territorial newspaper while he planned the day's work. The chair creaked under his weight, a sound that had become as familiar as his own breathing over the past 2 decades. His weathered hands wrapped around a ceramic mug, steam rising from black coffee that had grown cold while he watched the horizon. The wedding ring on his left hand caught a glint of sunlight, a simple gold band worn thin by years of cattle work and worry. Martha had slipped it on his finger 48 years ago in a small church in Santa Fe, her hands trembling with joy and nerves. Now, it felt like the only thing anchoring him to a past worth remembering. The Maddox cattle empire sprawled across 30,000 acres of some of the most beautiful and unforgiving land in New Mexico territory. Rolling grasslands gave way to red rock formations that jutted from the earth like ancient monuments to time itself. Arroyos cut deep channels through the landscape, carrying precious rainwater when the skies finally opened, leaving behind networks of dry creek beds that told stories of flash floods and drought cycles that had shaped this land for millennia. It hadn't always been this quiet. Once, the ranch hummed with activity from dawn to dusk, cowboys riding the fence lines, cattle lowing in the distance, Martha's laughter carrying from the kitchen where she'd prepare meals for a dozen men during roundup season. The bunkhouse had been full then, with hands who'd become like family, gathering around the long wooden table for supper, and stories that grew taller with each telling. But that was before the automobile changed how people moved cattle to market, before the younger generation started heading to cities for work in factories and offices, before Martha took sick with the fever that no amount of money or prayer could cure, and long before little Jake. Gus shook his head, pushing away memories that still cut like a rusty blade even after all these years. Some wounds never properly healed, no matter how much time passed over them. These days, the only regular company he kept was Miguel Santos, a man whose loyalty had proven as enduring as the mesas themselves. Miguel had started working the ranch as a young man of 20, back when Gus was building his fortune 1 head of cattle at a time. Now, in his 60s, with silver threading through his black hair and lines mapping a lifetime of hard work across his dark features, Miguel served as foreman, cook, confidant, and the closest thing to family Gus had left. "Patron, you missed breakfast again." Miguel's voice carried across the porch as he approached with a plate of scrambled eggs and biscuits. His boots made soft, scuffing sounds against the weathered boards, a rhythm Gus had learned to find comforting over the years. "Wasn't hungry," Gus replied, though his stomach betrayed him with a low rumble. Miguel set the plate on the small table beside Gus's chair and leaned against the porch rail, his keen eyes studying the older man with the practiced assessment of someone who'd spent decades reading weather patterns and cattle moods. "That bird came back again this morning, sat right here on this rail for near an hour, just watching the house. Gus's attention sharpened. The baby eagle no bigger than a man's fist, with mottled brown and white feathers that caught the light like burnished copper, had been appearing every morning for the past week. She wasn't like the adult eagles that soared high above the mesas, hunting prairie dogs and jackrabbits with patient precision. This one seemed different, almost deliberate in her behavior. "She doesn't act like a wild bird," Gus observed, finally taking a bite of Miguel's perfectly seasoned eggs. "Wild birds don't perch 3 feet from a man and stare like they're trying to tell him something." "Maybe she's telling you it's time to come inside and eat proper meals," Miguel suggested, with the gentle humor of a man who'd learned to navigate around grief with care. "Or maybe she thinks you've got food to share." But Gus didn't think it was about food. The eagle never showed interest in crumbs or scraps. She simply arrived each morning as the sun painted the mesas gold, landed on the porch rail, and fixed him with an unwavering gaze that seemed far too knowing for such a young bird. When she finally took flight, she'd circle once above the house, then head west toward the deeper canyons that cut through the back sections of his land, areas he'd rarely explored, even in his younger days, when every acre had been precious territory to claim and defend. "Tell me about the western sections again," Gus said suddenly, surprising himself with the question. Miguel raised an eyebrow. "The canyon country? Nothing much out there, patron. Too rough for cattle, too far from water sources. Some old mining claims from the Silver Rush days, but they played out decades ago. Why? Just wondering. In all these years, I've never ridden out that way. Seems strange. A man not knowing every inch of his own land." "You had more pressing concerns when you were building this place," Miguel reminded him gently. "Martha needed you close to home, especially after—" He stopped himself, the unfinished sentence hanging in the morning air like smoke. "After Jake died." The words didn't need to be spoken for both men to understand. Everything in their lives seemed to divide into before and after that terrible day 23 years ago, when a 6-year-old boy with his mother's laugh and his father's stubborn streak had climbed onto a horse too big for him and paid the price for childhood curiosity. Gus had built his cattle brand iron that same year, forging the distinctive M in a circle that would become his mark on thousands of head of cattle over the following decades. He'd thrown himself into work with the desperate energy of a man trying to outrun grief, expanding the ranch, buying more land, building more wealth as if success could somehow fill the hole that loss had torn in his world. The irony wasn't lost on him. Now he'd become one of the wealthiest men in the territory, but he'd trade every acre, every dollar, every head of cattle for just one more day with his boy. One more chance to teach Jake how to properly mount a horse, how to read the sky for weather signs, how to gentle a spooked calf with patience instead of force. "You know what Martha used to say about regret?" Miguel asked, settling into the chair that had once been hers. "She said it was like trying to ride a horse backward. You can see where you've been clear as day, but you can't see where you're going, and you're guaranteed to fall off." Gus smiled despite the ache in his chest. Martha had possessed a gift for distilling life's complexities into simple truths that stuck with a person long after the words were spoken. She'd been the steady hand that guided their family through good times and bad, the voice of reason when his temper ran hot, the source of laughter that made their house feel like a home instead of just a place to sleep between workdays. She had a way with words, he agreed, twirling the wedding ring around his finger, a habit he'd developed in the years since her passing. "Sometimes I think I hear her voice in the wind, telling me to stop sitting around feeling sorry for myself." "Maybe that's exactly what she's doing," Miguel suggested. "And maybe that little eagle is carrying the message." Before Gus could respond to that observation, a shadow passed overhead. Both men looked up to see the baby eagle circling above the porch, her wings catching the thermal currents that rose from the sun-warmed boards. She completed 2 full circles, then landed on the rail exactly where she'd been sitting earlier, fixing Gus with that same intense, knowing stare. "There she is again," Miguel murmured, "punctual as a church bell." The eagle tilted her head, studying Gus with one bright eye, then the other. For a moment that seemed to stretch beyond the boundaries of normal time, man and bird regarded each other across a divide that felt both vast and surprisingly narrow. Then the eagle spread her wings, launched herself into the morning air, and began flying west toward the canyon country. But this time was different. This time she stopped after 50 yards and circled back, hovering in place as if waiting for something. When Gus made no move to follow, she repeated the pattern, flying west, stopping, circling back. The message was unmistakable. Follow me. Well, I'll be damned, Miguel breathed. She wants you to come with her. Gus felt something stir in his chest that he hadn't experienced in years. Curiosity mixed with anticipation, like a man who'd been offered a glimpse behind a curtain he'd never thought to pull aside. The rational part of his mind insisted this was foolishness, that eagles didn't carry messages, and old men shouldn't go chasing after wild birds across dangerous terrain. But another part of him, the part that remembered what it felt like to believe in possibilities beyond the visible horizon, whispered that sometimes the most important journeys began with the smallest steps of faith. "Miguel," he said slowly, "Saddle Bell. I think it's time I got to know my own land a little better." Bell's hooves found purchase on the rocky trail with the sure-footed confidence of a horse that had spent her entire life navigating New Mexico's unforgiving terrain. The chestnut mare was getting on in years, nearly 20 now, but she still carried herself with the grace and intelligence that had made her Martha's favorite mount. Gus had considered retiring her to pasture years ago, but something about the way she perked up whenever he approached the stable told him she wasn't ready for a life of idle grazing. The baby eagle maintained her position about 50 yards ahead, occasionally circling back when Gus fell too far behind, her pattern as deliberate as a scout, leading troops through unfamiliar territory. They'd been riding for nearly 2 hours, climbing steadily through terrain that grew more rugged with each mile. Red sandstone formations jutted from the earth like the bones of sleeping giants, their surfaces carved into fantastic shapes by millions of years of wind and weather. This was country Gus had owned for decades, but never truly explored. When he'd been building his empire, these remote sections had seemed too far from the main ranch operations to warrant attention. The good grazing land lay closer to home, near reliable water sources and established trails. Out here, the landscape was beautiful but harsh, a place where a man could easily find himself in trouble if he wasn't paying attention to the sky or the condition of his horse. The eagle suddenly veered north, following what appeared to be an ancient game trail that wound between towering rock formations. Gus guided Bell after her, ducking under low-hanging juniper branches and navigating around boulders that had tumbled from the cliffs above during some long-ago flash flood. The silence was profound out here, broken only by the soft sound of Bell's breathing and the occasional cry of a red-tailed hawk circling high overhead. Then Bell stopped so abruptly that Gus nearly pitched forward over her neck. Her ears swiveled forward, focused on something ahead that had caught her attention. Gus followed her gaze and saw them, a line of weathered wooden stakes driven into the ground at regular intervals, each one bearing a small metal tag that glinted in the afternoon sunlight. Surveyor markers. Gus dismounted and walked to the nearest stake, his boots crunching on the gravelly soil. The metal tag was corroded with age, but he could still make out numbers and symbols that meant nothing to him. These markers had been here for years, decades, judging by the way the wood had weathered and the vegetation had grown around them. But why were there surveyor markers on his land? He'd never commissioned any surveys out here, never had any reason to plot boundaries or mineral rights in terrain this remote and difficult to access. The baby eagle had perched on a dead snag 20 feet away, watching him with that same intense stare she'd given him from the porch rail. Her presence here felt less like coincidence and more like guidance, as if she'd deliberately led him to this discovery. Gus pulled a small notebook from his vest pocket and sketched the location relative to the rock formations around him. Martha had taught him the value of keeping detailed records, a habit that had served him well in business dealings over the years. Whatever these markers represented, he had a feeling they were important. As he tucked the notebook away, memories began surfacing, unbidden fragments of conversations and half-forgotten details that had seemed insignificant at the time. Theodore Garrison, the lawyer who'd handled his land acquisitions during the expansion years, mentioning something about mineral surveys, claims that had been filed and abandoned when the silver boom went bust, paperwork that Gus had signed without reading carefully, trusting Garrison's expertise in legal matters. The memories carried a bitter taste now. Garrison had been more than his lawyer, he'd been a friend, or so Gus had believed. A man who'd shared meals at their table, who'd bounced little Jake on his knee and told Martha she made the finest cornbread in the territory. A man who'd stood beside the tiny grave when they laid their boy to rest, his face appropriately somber as he spoke words of comfort that now felt hollow in retrospect. Jake's death had shattered more than just their family. It had shattered Gus's ability to trust his own judgment about people. In the immediate aftermath of the accident, when grief had clouded his thinking and Martha had retreated into a silence that lasted months, Gus had leaned heavily on Garrison's guidance for both personal and business matters. Looking back, he couldn't shake the feeling that his vulnerability had been exploited in ways he was only beginning to understand. The eagle took flight again, heading deeper into the canyon where the walls rose higher and the shadows grew longer. Gus remounted Bell and followed, his mind churning with questions that had no easy answers. The trail switched back down into a narrow gorge where a seasonal creek had carved channels through red rock, creating natural pools that held water even during the dry months. It was beautiful country, the kind of hidden wilderness that could take a man's breath away with its raw, untouched majesty. But it was also isolated, the perfect place for someone to hide things they didn't want found. Near the bottom of the gorge, the eagle led him to another discovery that made his blood run cold. Tucked under a rock overhang, protected from weather and curious eyes, sat an old wooden crate with T. Garrison Surveying, stenciled on the side in faded black letters. Gus's hands trembled as he pried open the weathered lid. Inside, wrapped in oiled canvas, was a collection of documents that told a story he'd never suspected. Survey maps showing mineral claims on his land, correspondence with mining companies interested in silver extraction, and most damning of all, a copy of a legal document that purported to give Garrison exclusive mining rights to several sections of the Maddox ranch, a document that bore Gus's signature, but that he had absolutely no memory of signing. The forgery was expertly done, almost perfect in its replication of his handwriting. But there were small differences that his trained eye could detect, subtle variations in the loops and angles that spoke of careful study rather than natural penmanship. Someone had spent considerable time learning to mimic his signature, practicing until they could create a convincing fake. But the real shock came when he found the photograph at the bottom of the crate. It was a family portrait taken just months before Jake's accident. Gus, Martha, and their beautiful 6-year-old son standing in front of the ranch house, all of them smiling into the camera with the innocent happiness of people who believed their world was secure. The photograph was cracked down the middle, as if someone had folded it carelessly, and there was a dark stain in one corner that looked disturbingly like dried blood. Why would Garrison have this photograph? And why was it hidden in a crate with forged documents and illegal mining claims? Gus felt the ground shifting beneath him like quicksand, everything he'd believed about the past 23 years suddenly thrown into question. Jake's accident, had it really been an accident? Martha's lingering illness after their son's death, had grief been the only cause, or had there been other factors he'd been too blind to see? The baby eagle perched on the edge of the rock overhang, her dark eyes reflecting depths that seemed far older than her apparent youth. In that moment, staring into those knowing eyes while holding evidence of betrayal that ran deeper than he'd ever imagined, Gus felt something fundamental shift inside him. He'd spent 23 years believing that his family had been destroyed by tragic circumstances beyond anyone's control. But what if that wasn't true? What if the people he'd trusted most had orchestrated a deception so profound that it had cost him everything he valued in life? The eagle spread her wings and took flight, heading back toward the ranch house as the afternoon shadows began to lengthen across the canyon walls. But Gus remained where he was, holding the cracked photograph and trying to process the implications of what he'd discovered. For the first time in over 2 decades, Augustus Maddox had a purpose that extended beyond mere survival. He had questions that demanded answers, and a growing suspicion that the baby eagle hadn't just stumbled into his life by chance. She'd come to show him the truth he'd been too broken to see. The ride back to the ranch house took place in a haze of conflicting emotions that Gus couldn't begin to untangle. Belle seemed to sense his distress, picking her way carefully along the rocky trail while he clutched the reins with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. The cracked family photograph rode safely in his vest pocket, pressed against his heart like a talisman that might ward off the growing certainty that his entire life had been built on lies. Miguel was waiting on the porch when they returned, his weathered face creased with concern as he watched Gus dismount with the slow, deliberate movements of a man who'd aged a decade in the span of an afternoon. The baby eagle had already returned, perched on her usual spot on the porch rail, as if she'd been there all along. "Patron, you look like you've seen a ghost," Miguel observed, taking Belle's reins and studying Gus's pale complexion with the practiced eye of a man who'd learned to read trouble in all its forms. "Maybe I have," Gus replied, his voice hoarse with emotion. He sank into his familiar chair, suddenly feeling every one of his 73 years settling into his bones like lead weights. "Miguel, do you remember Theodore Garrison?" The question brought a subtle change to Miguel's expression, a tightening around the eyes that suggested the name carried unpleasant associations. "The lawyer? See, I remember him. He stopped coming around after Signora Martha passed. Why do you ask? Did you ever trust him?" Miguel was quiet for a long moment, leading Belle toward the stable before answering. When he returned, his response was carefully measured. "It was not my place to trust or mistrust him, Patron." But he hesitated, then seemed to reach a decision. "There were things about that man that never sat right with me." "What kind of things?" "The way he looked at the land when he thought no one was watching, like he was calculating its value instead of appreciating its beauty. And the questions he would ask about the remote sections, the canyons where we never ran cattle. He claimed it was for legal purposes, making sure the boundaries were properly documented, but Miguel shrugged. "A man learns to trust his instincts about people, and my instincts said that one bore watching." Gus pulled the photograph from his pocket, studying the 3 smiling faces that represented everything he'd lost. Jake had been such a beautiful child, with Martha's gentle eyes and that stubborn cowlick that never would lie flat no matter how much pomade they used. The boy had possessed an insatiable curiosity about everything around him, constantly asking questions about the ranch, the animals, the vast landscape that stretched beyond the horizon. "Tell me about the day Jake died," Gus said suddenly. "Everything you remember, even the smallest details." Miguel's face went very still. In all the years since the accident, they'd rarely spoken about that terrible day in any detail. The pain had been too fresh, too raw, and both men had learned to navigate around it like sailors avoiding dangerous shoals. "Are you certain you want to revisit that, Patron? I need to know." "Something's changed, Miguel. I found things today that make me question whether Jake's death really was an accident." The older man's eyes sharpened. "What kind of things?" Instead of answering directly, Gus described his journey into the canyons, the surveyor markers, and the hidden crate with its damning contents. He watched Miguel's expression grow increasingly grim as the story unfolded, saw the flash of anger that crossed his weathered features when he mentioned the forged documents. "That explains much," Miguel said when Gus finished. "I always wondered how Garrison could afford to expand his practice so quickly after the silver boom ended. Most of the other lawyers left when the mining companies pulled out, but he stayed and prospered. Now tell me about Jake." Miguel settled into Martha's old chair, his movements heavy with reluctance. "It was a Saturday morning in early spring. You had ridden out to check the north pasture, where some of the fencing had been damaged in a storm. Senora Martha was in town visiting her sister, who was feeling poorly. Jake was supposed to stay close to the house, but you know how curious that boy was." Gus nodded, remembering his son's boundless energy and endless questions about everything, from cloud formations to why cattle preferred certain types of grass. "I was working in the stable repairing a broken bridle when I heard voices from the main corral. Men talking, but not ranch hands. Their voices were different, more educated. City men. I went to investigate and found Garrison there with 2 other men I didn't recognize. They said they were showing potential investors around the property, that you had given permission. I never gave any such permission. I suspected as much even then. But Garrison was your lawyer and your friend, so I didn't challenge him directly. I just made sure to keep an eye on them." Miguel's jaw tightened with remembered tension. Jake appeared while they were there. He'd been exploring near the corrals and came running up with that wooden horse you'd carved for him, excited to show it to the visitors. The wooden horse. Gus had spent weeks crafting that toy for Jake's 6th birthday, carving it from a piece of oak and painting it to look like Belle. The boy had treasured it, carrying it everywhere and making up elaborate stories about cowboys and adventures in the wild country beyond the ranch. One of the men, a thin fellow with a scar on his cheek, took particular interest in Jake, asked him all sorts of questions about his favorite places to play, whether he ever rode the horses, how well he knew the canyon country. It struck me as odd at the time, a grown man showing such interest in a child's games. Gus felt ice forming in his veins. What happened next? They left shortly after that, heading toward the western sections of the ranch. I thought about following them, but you'd asked me to repair the windmill pump that day, and I was already behind schedule. About an hour later, I heard Jake crying. Miguel's voice grew thick with emotion. Found him by the big corral, holding his wooden horse and sobbing like his heart was broken. He said the men had told him stories about treasure hidden in the canyons, gold and silver just waiting for someone brave enough to go looking. The pieces were falling into place with horrible clarity. Garrison hadn't just been running illegal mining operations, he'd been using Jake as an unwitting scout, filling the boy's head with tales of adventure that would draw him into dangerous territory. He asked if I thought the stories were true. Miguel continued. I told him they sounded like tall tales, the kind grown-ups sometimes tell to entertain children, but I could see the idea had taken root in his imagination. And the next morning, his bed was empty. We found tracks leading toward the canyon country, and later, Miguel's voice broke. Later, we found him at the bottom of Devil's Drop, with that wooden horse still clutched in his little hand. Gus closed his eyes, finally understanding the true scope of Garrison's betrayal. The lawyer hadn't just stolen land and forged documents, he'd weaponized a child's curiosity, turning Jake's natural adventurous spirit into a tool for reconnaissance that had ultimately cost the boy his life. The baby eagle took flight from the porch rail, circling once above their heads before heading back toward the canyon country. But this time, Gus understood her message with perfect clarity. She wasn't just showing him the past, she was leading him toward justice. That night, sleep proved as elusive as smoke on the wind. Gus lay in the bed he'd once shared with Martha, staring at the ceiling while memories churned through his mind like tumbleweeds in a dust storm. Every conversation with Garrison took on new significance, every smile and handshake reframed as potential deception. He'd trusted that man, with his family's future, and that trust had been repaid with calculated manipulation that cost him everything. When dawn finally broke across the mesas, Gus was already dressed and waiting on the porch with a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours earlier. The baby eagle arrived precisely at sunrise, as she had every morning for the past week, but today her behavior seemed different, more urgent. She landed on the rail, fixed him with that penetrating stare for exactly 30 seconds, then took flight toward the canyons without her usual circling pattern. The message was clear: follow me. Now. Belle seemed to sense the urgency as well, stepping out with a purposeful gait that covered ground quickly while maintaining sure footing on the increasingly treacherous terrain. They followed a different route this time, one that led deeper into the canyon system, where towering red walls created natural corridors that had been carved by millions of years of wind and water. The eagle guided them to a section of canyon Gus had never seen before, where ancient Pueblo ruins clung to ledges high above the canyon floor like forgotten prayers carved in stone. The silence here felt profound, weighted with the presence of people who had lived and died in this place centuries before the first European had set foot in the territory. Near the base of the canyon wall, partially hidden by fallen boulders and desert vegetation, Gus discovered something that made him dismount immediately. Petroglyphs covered a smooth section of rock face, dozens of images depicting eagles, human figures, and symbols whose meanings had been lost to time. But it wasn't the age of the artwork that captured his attention. It was the fresh scratches nearby, where someone had recently chipped away at the rock with metal tools. The baby eagle perched on a dead juniper branch above the petroglyphs, her dark eyes reflecting an intelligence that seemed far beyond her apparent youth. As Gus studied the ancient artwork, trying to understand why she'd brought him here, he noticed something that made his breath catch in his throat. Embedded in a crack in the rock face, nearly invisible unless you knew exactly where to look, was the tip of an arrow point. Not a modern arrowhead meant for hunting, but something older, a piece of flint, napped with the skill of someone who'd learned the craft from masters who'd been perfecting it for generations. Gus carefully extracted the arrow point, marveling at its craftsmanship. The edges were still sharp enough to cut, despite having been wedged in the rock for who knew how long. The flint was a beautiful golden color, with bands of darker stone running through it like veins of Earth's blood. "What are you trying to tell me, little one?" he asked the eagle, holding the arrow point up so it caught the morning light. As if in response, the eagle took flight and led him further into the canyon, where the walls narrowed and the shadows grew deeper. They climbed steadily for another hour, following what appeared to be an ancient trail that switchbacked up the canyon wall through a series of natural ledges and handholds that had been improved over generations of use. At the top of the climb, the canyon opened into a hidden valley that took Gus's breath away. A natural spring fed a small creek that meandered through grass that grew green and lush even in the dry season. Ancient cottonwoods provided shade, and wildflowers painted the meadows in colors that seemed too vivid for the harsh desert landscape surrounding them. But it was the structure at the far end of the valley that made Gus's heart race with excitement and dread in equal measure. A small cabin sat nestled against the canyon wall, its weathered logs blending so well with the natural stone that it was almost invisible from a distance. Smoke rose from a stone chimney, and a well-maintained garden showed signs of recent cultivation. Someone was living here, in a place so remote that he'd never known it existed despite owning this section of territory for decades. The baby eagle circled the cabin once, then landed on its roof and called out with a sharp cry that echoed off the canyon walls. Almost immediately the cabin door opened, and an elderly man stepped into the sunlight. He was Native American, probably in his 80s, with long white hair braided with leather and feathers. His face was deeply lined, but his eyes were clear and bright, holding the same kind of knowing intelligence Gus had seen in the eagle's gaze. He wore traditional clothing mixed with practical modern elements, buckskin pants, a cotton shirt, and boots that had seen decades of hard use. "Augustus Maddox," the old man said, his voice carrying clearly across the valley. "I have been waiting a long time for you to find this place." Gus felt as though the ground had shifted beneath him. "You know who I am? I know many things about you. I know about your son, your wife, and the man who has been stealing from your land for 20 years. I know about the eagle who has been trying to guide you here." The old man gestured for Gus to approach. "My name is Joseph Running Bear, and I am the keeper of this place. The eagle you have been following belongs to my granddaughter." "Your granddaughter? She died 3 years ago, but her spirit lives on in the birds she raised and trained. This one," he pointed to the eagle, who had settled on a fence post near the garden. "This one was her favorite. She called her little sister and taught her to carry messages between the world of the living and the world of spirits." Gus felt his rational mind struggling to process what he was hearing, but something deeper, the part of him that had always been drawn to the mysteries hidden in the vast landscape around him, accepted the old man's words as truth. "She's been trying to tell me something," Gus said. "She's been trying to show you that the past is not what you believed it to be, that the death of your son was not an accident, and that the man you trusted has been using your grief as a shield for his crimes." Joseph Running Bear's eyes flashed with anger. "But she's also been trying to tell you that not all is lost, that some things which appear to be dead may still live, if you have the courage to look beyond the surface of what you think you know." The old man turned back toward his cabin. "Come. There are things you need to see, and people you need to meet. The eagle has brought you here for a purpose, and that purpose is about to be revealed." The interior of Joseph Running Bear's cabin was a testament to a life lived deliberately and with purpose. Handcrafted furniture filled the space with the warmth of skilled workmanship, while shelves lined the walls, holding books, artifacts, and carefully preserved plant specimens. The stone fireplace dominated one wall, its mantelpiece decorated with eagle feathers, smooth river stones, and framed photographs spanning several generations. But it was what Joseph pulled from a wooden chest beneath the window that made Gus's knees nearly buckle. A leather-bound journal, its cover worn smooth by countless hands, bearing Martha's distinctive handwriting on the front. "Private Thoughts, M.E. Maddox." "Where did you get this?" Gus whispered, his voice barely audible above the crackling of the fire. "Your wife brought it to me 3 months before she died," Joseph replied gently, settling into a chair across from Gus. "She was a troubled woman by then, carrying burdens that were eating away at her spirit like acid on metal. She said if anything happened to her, I should make sure you eventually saw what she had written." Gus's hands trembled as he opened the journal to the first page. Martha's graceful script covered the yellowed paper, dated just 6 months after Jake's funeral. Asterisk, "I cannot sleep. Every night I dream of Jake calling for help, but I can never reach him. Theodore came by again today with more papers to sign. He says it's all routine business, settling Jake's affairs, but something in his manner troubles me. The way he looks at me when he thinks I'm not watching like a hawk studying a wounded rabbit." Asterisk. Gus felt his heart hammering against his ribs as he continued reading. Page after page revealed Martha's growing suspicions about Garrison, her careful documentation of inconsistencies in his stories, her growing certainty that Jake's death hadn't been the simple accident everyone believed it to be. Asterisk. Found Theodore's surveyor's compass in the barn today. When I asked him about it, he said he'd been helping Augustus map the property boundaries. But Augustus never mentioned any mapping project, and when I brought it up at dinner, he looked genuinely confused. Why would Theodore lie about something so trivial unless he was hiding something much larger? Asterisk. She investigated him, Gus said, looking up at Joseph with wonder and heartbreak warring in his expression. All those months when I thought she was just grieving, she was actually She was trying to find the truth about your son's death, Joseph confirmed. She came to me because I knew the old stories, the history of this land that goes back long before any white man claimed ownership. She wanted to understand why Jake had been so drawn to the canyon country that he would risk everything to explore it. Gus turned more pages, watching his wife's handwriting grow increasingly urgent as her investigation deepened. Asterisk spoke with Maria Santos today. She mentioned seeing Theodore's buggy heading toward the western canyons the morning before Jake disappeared. He told Augustus he was in Santa Fe that day, but Maria's eyes are sharp and she knows every vehicle that passes through this country. Why would he lie about where he was? Asterisk. Found strange markings carved into the rocks near Devil's Drop, fresh cuts that look like someone was testing the stone for mineral content. The marks are exactly the kind mining engineers make when surveying for silver deposits. Jake fell from those same rocks. Was he following someone who was supposed to be his friend? Asterisk. The entries painted a picture of a woman consumed by the need for justice, methodically gathering evidence while maintaining the facade of a grieving mother. But as Gus continued reading, he began to see signs that Martha's investigation had not gone unnoticed. Asterisk. Theodore has been asking strange questions about my health, suggesting I see a doctor about my melancholy, offering to recommend specialists in Santa Fe who could help with my condition. But I'm not sick, I'm angry. There's a difference, though I suspect he hopes no one else will recognize it. Asterisk. The medicine he brought for my headaches tastes bitter, leaves me feeling foggy and confused for hours afterward. I've started pretending to take it, hiding the pills instead. Amazing how much clearer my thinking becomes when I'm not under the influence of his helpful remedies. Asterisk. Gus felt rage building in his chest like steam in a boiler. Garrison hadn't just manipulated Jake and forged documents, he'd been slowly poisoning Martha, using her grief as cover for a systematic attempt to silence her investigation. She figured it out, he said, his voice thick with emotion. She knew what he was doing to her. Joseph nodded gravely. Read the final entries. The last pages of the journal revealed Martha's desperate race against time as her health deteriorated despite her efforts to avoid Garrison's medicine. Asterisk. I've hidden copies of all my evidence in 3 separate locations. Joseph Running Bear has agreed to keep one set safe. He's the only person I trust completely. If something happens to me, he'll know what to do. Augustus is too trusting, too broken by grief, to see the wolf in sheep's clothing that has been circling our family for years. Asterisk. Theodore's patience is wearing thin. He's been pushing harder for me to sign additional legal documents, claiming they'll secure Augustus's financial future. But I've read them carefully, and they give Theodore increasing control over ranch operations and mineral rights. I've refused to sign, and now he's talking about having me declared mentally incompetent. The irony is bitter. The woman investigating his crimes may be declared insane for refusing to believe his lies. Asterisk. The final entry was dated just 1 week before Martha's death. Asterisk. I know now that Jake's death was no accident. Theodore had been filling the boy's head with treasure stories for months, using him to scout the mineral-rich sections of our land. When Jake got too close to Theodore's illegal mining operations, he became a liability. A 6-year-old child, murdered for stumbling onto a secret that could have exposed everything. Asterisk. I have proof now, witnesses who saw Theodore's men in the canyon the day Jake died, evidence of mineral extraction that began before Jake's body was even cold. But I'm running out of time. The poison is working faster now, and Theodore is growing bolder about increasing the doses. I can feel my strength ebbing away like water through a cracked vessel. Asterisk. If anyone reads this, know that I fought for justice as long as I was able, My son was murdered, and my husband has been betrayed by a man he trusted like a brother. The truth is hidden in these pages, and in the evidence I've gathered. Someone must carry on this fight, because our family deserves better than to be destroyed by greed disguised as friendship. Asterisk. Gus closed the journal with hands that shook with fury and heartbreak in equal measure. Martha had died knowing the truth about Jake's murder, carrying that terrible knowledge alone because she'd understood that Garrison would kill anyone who threatened his carefully constructed deception. She saved evidence, he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. 3 copies, Joseph confirmed, hidden in places where only someone who loved this land as much as she did would think to look. The Eagle has been trying to guide you to the first location. There are 2 more to find, and when you have them all, we'll have enough to expose what Garrison did, to get justice for Martha and Jake. Joseph's weathered face creased into something that might have been a smile if it hadn't been tempered by decades of sorrow. Justice, yes, but also something else your wife hoped for, something she discovered in her final weeks of investigation that she didn't have time to fully explore. What do you mean? The old man stood and walked to the fireplace, removing a photograph from the mantelpiece. He handed it to Gus, who found himself staring at an image that defied everything he thought he knew about the past. It was Jake, but not the 6-year-old boy who had died 23 years ago. This Jake was a grown man with Martha's gentle eyes and Gus's stubborn chin, very much alive, and very much looking directly into the camera with a gaze that held both sorrow and hope in equal measure. The photograph trembled in Gus's weathered hands as he stared at the impossible image. The face, looking back at him, carried the unmistakable features of the Maddox bloodline, the strong jaw he'd inherited from his own father, the gentle curve of the eyes that had been Martha's most beautiful feature, the slight cleft in the chin that had marked 3 generations of Maddox men. "This can't be real," he whispered, but his voice carried no conviction. Deep in his heart, in the place where a father's love never dies, he knew he was looking at his son. "The photograph was taken 6 months ago," Joseph said quietly. Martha had hired a private investigator from Denver, a man who specialized in cases that others considered closed. She paid him with jewelry she'd inherited from her mother, items she'd never told you about because she wanted to keep them for emergencies. Gus turned the photograph over and found writing in Martha's careful script, asterisk, Jacob Maddox, age 29, photographed outside Denver assay office, October 1897, alive, changed name to Jake Matthews. Working as mining engineer under false identity, still in danger from T.G. and Associates, must protect until evidence gathered. Asterisk. "She found him," Gus breathed, his voice breaking. "Our boy was alive, and she found him." The investigator tracked him through a series of orphanages and work camps. After the staged accident, Garrison's men took Jake deep into Colorado territory, where he was placed with families who believed they were helping a boy whose parents had died in an Apache raid. He grew up thinking you and Martha were dead, just as you believed he was dead. The magnitude of Garrison's deception was staggering. Not content with simply murdering a child who had stumbled onto his illegal operations, he'd created an elaborate conspiracy that destroyed 2 families while protecting his criminal enterprise. "But why keep Jake alive at all?" Gus asked, struggling to understand the twisted logic behind such cruelty. Joseph's expression grew grim. "Because a dead child draws investigation, especially when that child belongs to one of the wealthiest ranchers in the territory. But a child who simply disappears after a tragic accident that's easier to explain away as a grieving father's inability to accept the truth." They were interrupted by the sound of hoofbeats echoing off the canyon walls. Joseph moved to the window and peered out, his weathered features tightening with concern. "We have visitors," he said. 3 riders, heading up the trail. They're not moving. Like men who are lost, they know exactly where they're going. Gus joined him at the window and felt his blood run cold. Leading the group was a man he recognized despite the 20 years that had passed since their last meeting, Carl Jensen, one of Garrison's associates who'd claimed to be a cattle buyer, but had always seemed more interested in the ranch's boundaries than its livestock. "They've found us," Gus said. "Not us," Joseph corrected. "You. Garrison has been watching your movements for years, waiting to see if you'd ever start asking the wrong questions. Your sudden interest in the western canyons must have triggered alarms." Joseph moved quickly to a cedar chest in the corner of the room, withdrawing items that spoke of a man prepared for trouble. A well-maintained Winchester rifle, a cavalry pistol that had seen service in the Indian Wars, and a leather pouch containing what appeared to be official documents. Martha wasn't the only one gathering evidence, Joseph explained as he loaded the rifle with practiced efficiency. "My people have been watching Garrison's operations for years. We knew he was stealing from the land, violating sacred sites to dig for silver that belonged in the earth, not in the pockets of greedy men." Gus felt pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place. "The arrow point I found, you left it there for me to discover. My granddaughter left many signs over the years, hoping someone would eventually follow them to the truth. The eagle learned the routes from watching her, understanding that someday she might need to guide a seeker to the evidence that could bring justice." The riders were closer now, their horses picking their way carefully up the narrow trail that led to the hidden valley. Through the window, Gus could see Jensen's scarred face, clearly enough to read the determination written in his expression. This wasn't a social visit. These men had come prepared for violence. Joseph handed Gus the cavalry pistol. "Do you remember how to use one of these?" "A man doesn't forget," Gus replied, checking the cylinder and finding it loaded with 6 fresh cartridges. The weight of the weapon in his hand brought back memories of his younger days, when survival often depended on quick thinking and quicker reflexes. "There's a back trail that leads deeper into the canyon system," Joseph said, pulling on a leather vest that had been reinforced with metal plates armor disguised as everyday clothing. "If we can reach it before they get established in the valley, we can lead them into terrain where numbers don't matter as much." "What about the evidence? Martha's documents?" Joseph smiled grimly as he patted the leather pouch. "Everything is here, copies of all 3 sets of evidence your wife gathered, plus documentation my people have been collecting for 2 decades. Garrison's entire operation is laid out in these papers, including the names of everyone involved in Jake's kidnapping and your wife's murder." The baby eagle suddenly appeared at the window, calling sharply before taking flight toward the back of the valley. Her message was clear: time to go. "She'll guide us," Joseph said, shouldering a pack that contained essentials for a potentially long chase through dangerous territory. "The eagle knows trails that aren't on any map, paths that lead to places where we can make a stand if necessary." As they prepared to leave through the cabin's rear door, Gus took one last look at the photograph of his grown son. Jake was alive, somewhere in Colorado, probably unaware that his father had finally learned the truth about his disappearance. The realization filled Gus with a fierce determination that burned away 23 years of grief and self-doubt. He'd lost his son once to Garrison's greed and deception. He wouldn't lose the chance to expose that truth now, even if it meant facing down armed men who would kill to protect their secrets. The baby eagles circled overhead as they slipped out the back door and into the maze of canyons that would either lead them to safety or become their final battlefield. But for the first time in over 2 decades, Augustus Maddox felt truly alive, driven by purpose that went beyond mere survival. He was fighting for his family's honor, for justice that had been too long delayed, and for the chance to somehow reach across the years of separation and tell his son that he had never stopped loving him. Jensen's voice echoed off the canyon walls behind them. "Maddox, we know you're here. Let's talk like civilized men." But Gus was done talking. The time for words had ended 23 years ago, when Garrison had chosen greed over friendship, when innocent lives had been sacrificed to protect illegal profits. Now it was time for action. and the reckoning that had been building for over 2 decades. The narrow canyon trail twisted through red rock formations that seemed to close in around them like the walls of a natural fortress. The baby eagle flew ahead in a zigzag pattern that Gus was beginning to recognize as deliberate communication. Sharp turns meant danger, circling meant safety, straight flight meant keep moving. Joseph Running Bear moved through the terrain with the fluid grace of a man who'd spent 8 decades learning to read the landscape like a book written in stone and shadow. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew fainter as Jensen's men struggled with horses that weren't accustomed to the treacherous footing and narrow passages. But Gus knew their lead was temporary. Eventually the terrain would open up enough for mounted men to regain the advantage. "There's something I haven't told you," Joseph said, as they paused at a junction where 3 different trails split off in different directions. "About your son, about why he stayed hidden even after Martha found him." "What do you mean?" Joseph's weathered face carried the weight of secrets that had been kept too long. Jake didn't just disappear that day 23 years ago. He saw something that would have gotten him killed immediately if Garrison's men had realized what he'd witnessed. The eagle circled overhead, then dove toward the middle trail, the one that led deeper into the canyon system, where the walls rose highest and the shadows grew darkest. "Jake saw Garrison murder another child," Joseph continued as they followed the eagle's guidance. "A little Apache girl named Morning Star, daughter of a chief who'd been trying to protect the sacred sites in these canyons. She'd been spying on the mining operations, gathering information to take back to her people." Gus felt his stomach clench. The scope of Garrison's crimes was expanding beyond anything he'd imagined. Jake was playing near Devil's Drop when it happened. He watched from behind the rocks as Garrison struck down a child who was barely older than he was. That's when Garrison's men discovered him a witness to murder who couldn't be allowed to live, but whose death would bring too much scrutiny. They reached a section of trail where the canyon walls opened into a hidden amphitheater carved from red sandstone by millions of years of wind and water. Ancient pictographs covered the smooth stone surfaces, telling stories of hunts and ceremonies that predated European contact by centuries. But it was the fresh disturbance in the sandy floor that caught Gus's attention. Recent footprints leading to what appeared to be a natural cave opening in the far wall. The eagle landed on a boulder near the cave entrance and called sharply, her cry echoing off the surrounding walls. Joseph motioned for silence, then pointed to the tracks. "Boot prints," he whispered. "Made within the last day or two. Someone else has been using this place." They approached the cave carefully, weapons ready, but the silence that greeted them felt different from the watchful quiet of potential ambush. This was the silence of abandonment, of a place recently vacated by someone who might return at any moment. Inside the cave, Gus found himself staring at what could only be described as a command center. Maps covered every available surface, marked with locations throughout Colorado and New Mexico territories. Supply lists written in a precise hand detailed everything from mining equipment to food stores. And scattered across a makeshift desk were documents that made Gus's heart race, with recognition legal papers bearing the forged signatures of various territorial officials, land grants that transferred mineral rights from legitimate owners to shell companies controlled by Garrison's network. But it was the personal items that told the real story. A cavalry officer's campaign hat hung from a wooden peg driven into the cave wall. A military-issue saddlebag sat open, revealing civilian clothes mixed with items that spoke of a double life, false identity papers, hair dye, and a small mirror surrounded by the tools of disguise. Most telling of all was the handwriting samples spread across the desk, dozens of sheets covered with practice signatures, someone methodically learning to forge the name Theodore Garrison with expert precision. "This isn't Garrison's hideout," Gus realized, his voice echoing strangely in the confined space. "Someone's been studying him, learning to replicate his signature and his methods." Joseph picked up one of the maps, studying the markings that showed mining locations, supply routes, and what appeared to be guard posts throughout a network that stretched across 2 territories. Whoever's been using this place has been planning something big. This isn't just investigation, this is preparation for war. The sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed from the canyon entrance, much closer than they should have been possible. Jensen's men had found a faster route, or they knew where we were going, Joseph said grimly. Someone's been feeding them information. A new voice called from the amphitheater entrance, younger than Jensen's gruff tones, but carrying an authority that cut through the desert air like a blade. "Father, I know you're in there. We need to talk." Gus felt the world tilt sideways as he processed the word. "Father." The voice was speaking to him, using a term he hadn't heard directed at himself for 23 years. Joseph's eyes widened with understanding and something that might have been relief. "The eagle wasn't just leading you to evidence," he said softly. "She was leading you to him." Gus moved toward the cave entrance with legs that suddenly felt unsteady, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. As he emerged into the sunlight, he saw them 3 riders at the far end of the amphitheater, but Jensen was no longer in the lead. The man who'd called him father sat easily in the saddle, wearing the dust-covered clothing of someone who'd been traveling hard across rough country. His face carried the unmistakable features that Gus had seen in the photograph, but seeing them in living flesh was like witnessing a resurrection. This was Jake, not the 6-year-old boy who'd disappeared with his wooden horse, but a grown man of 29 who'd somehow learned to survive in a world that had tried to erase his very existence. "Hello, Father," Jake said, dismounting and walking forward with the confident stride of someone accustomed to command. "I'm sorry it took so long to arrange this meeting, but I had to be certain you were ready to hear the truth about what really happened 23 years ago." Behind Jake, Jensen and the 3rd rider remained mounted, but had their hands clearly visible, a gesture of truce rather than threat. As Gus looked more closely, he realized these weren't Garrison's men at all. Jensen's scarred face carried expression of grim satisfaction rather than menace, and his companion wore the practical clothing of a working ranch hand rather than the city attire of Garrison's usual associates. "You've been watching me," Gus said, his voice barely steady enough to carry the words. "For years," Jake confirmed, "ever since I learned the truth about my death and started planning to bring down the man who destroyed our family. The eagle has been our messenger, trained to guide you through a specific route that would lead you to the evidence you'd need to understand what really happened." Jake pulled a leather portfolio from his saddlebag, not the crude camp gear Gus had expected, but official documents bearing territorial seals and federal stamps. "My name is Captain Jacob Matthews, United States Army Corps of Engineers, currently on special assignment investigating territorial land fraud. For the past 5 years, I've been building a case that will not only expose Theodore Garrison's crimes, but bring down an entire network of corruption that reaches from local mining claims all the way to the territorial governor's office." The baby eagle flew down from her perch and landed on Jake's outstretched arm with the familiarity of long partnership. As she settled there, Gus could see the tiny leather band around her leg that marked her as a trained bird, not a wild messenger guided by mystical forces. "Mother found me just before she died," Jake continued, his voice heavy with controlled emotion. "She hired investigators, gathered evidence, and managed to get word to me about what Garrison had done. But she knew she was running out of time. He was poisoning her to keep her quiet, and she couldn't risk exposing the investigation before all the pieces were in place." Gus felt 23 years of grief and guilt shifting inside him like a landslide, making room for emotions he'd forgotten he was capable of feeling. Hope, pride, the fierce joy of a father seeing his child not just alive, but thriving, having grown into a man of purpose and honor despite circumstances that would have broken most people. So the eagle, the mysterious behavior leading me to evidence. All planned, Jake admitted, with a slight smile that carried echoes of the mischievous boy who'd once filled their house with laughter. "I've been waiting for the right moment to reveal myself, but I needed you to discover the truth gradually, to understand the scope of what we're dealing with before we make our final move against Garrison." Jake's expression hardened. "Because tomorrow, Father, we're going to destroy him." The reunion between father and son took place in the shadow of ancient petroglyphs that had witnessed countless generations of families torn apart and brought together by the harsh realities of frontier life. But for Gus, nothing in those ancient stories could have prepared him for the overwhelming surge of emotions that threatened to buckle his knees as he embraced the man his little boy had become. Captain Jacob Matthews, stood a full head taller than Gus remembered, his frame filled out with the lean muscle of someone who'd spent years in the saddle and on foot across unforgiving terrain. His hands, when they clasped his father's weathered ones, bore the calluses of hard work mixed with the ink stains that marked him as a man of letters and documentation. The boy who'd once carved wooden horses with his pocket knife had grown into a man who carried the authority of federal law enforcement and the strategic mind of a career military officer. 23 years, Gus whispered, his voice breaking as he studied the face that carried echoes of Martha's gentleness, tempered by steel he'd never expected to see in his son's features. "I thought we buried there was a body. A boy who died of typhus in one of the mining camps," Jake explained gently, his own voice thick with controlled emotion. "Garrison's men dressed him in my clothes and arranged the scene at Devil's Drop to look like a fall. By the time you and the sheriff arrived, the evidence of staging had been carefully removed." Jensen approached them, his scarred face creased with an expression that Gus now recognized as long-suppressed grief rather than menace. "Mr. Maddox, I owe you an apology that's 20 years overdue. I was working for Garrison when your boy disappeared, but I thought we were just relocating him, making it look like an accident to avoid a custody battle with relatives back east. I didn't learn about the murder, about what really happened to that Apache girl, until years later. Carl's been one of our best sources inside Garrison's organization," Jake added. "When he realized what he'd been part of, he came to the territorial authorities and offered to help build the case against his former employer." The third man dismounted and removed his hat, revealing the weathered features of someone Gus recognized but couldn't immediately place. Then the man spoke, and memory clicked into place with startling clarity. "Hello, Mr. Maddox. Tom Bradley, from the Denver Assay Office. Your wife hired me to investigate your son's disappearance, and I've been working with Captain Matthews ever since." Bradley was the private investigator Martha had mentioned in her journal, the man who'd tracked Jake through a series of false identities and ultimately helped orchestrate this elaborate sting operation that had taken years to develop. "The eagle," Gus said, looking up at the bird perched contentedly on Jake's arm. "How did you train her to be so precise in her guidance?" Jake's smile carried hints of the mischievous boy who'd once spent hours teaching tricks to ranch dogs and barn cats. "Her name is Scout, and she's the descendant of birds my foster family raised in Colorado. They were mining engineers who used trained raptors to survey dangerous terrain and carry messages between camps. When I learned about Mother's investigation, I spent 2 years training Scout to recognize specific landmarks and follow predetermined routes." Joseph Running Bear had remained silent throughout the reunion, but now he approached with the careful dignity of an elder who'd seen enough of life's cruelties to appreciate its rare moments of grace. "Your son has been living in my valley for the past 6 months, he told Gus, preparing for what we hope will be the final phase of this long hunt for justice. "Tomorrow is the spring territorial land auction," Jake explained, his tone shifting to the crisp professionalism of a military briefing. "Garrison has been planning to bid on several choice parcels using falsified documentation and stolen mineral surveys. He's also planning to complete a major silver shipment that will provide the cash reserves he needs to expand his operations into Arizona territory." Bradley opened a leather portfolio and spread documents across a flat boulder, creating an impromptu field office in the ancient amphitheater. We've identified 17 separate properties that Garrison has acquired through forged documents over the past 2 decades. The total value runs into hundreds of thousands of dollars, more than enough to trigger federal prosecution for grand theft and mail fraud. But more importantly, Jake continued, his voice hardening with determination, we've documented the murders. Morning Star, the Apache girl, I saw him kill all those years ago. 3 other children who stumbled onto his operations at various times. And Mother, we have medical testimony that the symptoms she experienced in her final months were consistent with arsenic poisoning administered in small, regular doses. Gus felt the pieces of a vast conspiracy finally clicking into place with terrible clarity. Garrison hadn't just been a greedy man taking advantage of legal loopholes. He'd been a systematic killer who'd used his position as a respected attorney to cover up a string of murders spanning more than 2 decades. How do we stop him? He asked, surprised by the steadiness of his own voice. Garrison will be at the Territorial Land Office in Santa Fe tomorrow morning, Jake replied, pulling out a detailed map of the territorial capital. He's planning to bid on the Morrison Ranch holdings, 15,000 acres of prime grazing land that the family was forced to sell after their mineral claims mysteriously became disputed in territorial court. Mysteriously, Jensen said with bitter irony. I helped file those false claim disputes 3 years ago, before I knew what I was really part of. The plan is elegant in its simplicity, Bradley explained. Garrison arrives expecting a routine land auction where he'll acquire property at below-market prices using falsified financial documents. Instead, he'll find federal marshals waiting with arrest warrants based on evidence that's been gathering for 5 years. But there's a problem, Jake admitted, his jaw tightening with frustration. Garrison's gotten suspicious about the increased attention on his operations. He's been liquidating assets, transferring money to banks in Mexico, and making preparations to disappear if necessary. If he suspects a trap, he might not show up at the auction at all. Which is where you come in, Father, Jake continued, meeting Gus's eyes with an expression that mixed hope and apprehension. We need something that will guarantee his appearance, something that will make him so confident of victory that he won't consider the possibility of a trap. Gus understood immediately. You want me to be there, to give him the satisfaction of seeing me publicly humiliated one final time. Garrison's greatest weakness has always been his ego, Bradley observed. He's never been content with simply winning. He needs his victims to know they've been beaten. Your presence at the auction, appearing broken and defeated, will be irresistible bait. The plan they outlined was both simple and terrifyingly complex. Gus would appear at the auction as a broken old man, making a desperate final bid to save some small portion of his holdings. Garrison, seeing his old victim in apparent defeat, would be unable to resist the opportunity to gloat publicly over the man whose family he'd destroyed. Meanwhile, Jake would be positioned among the federal marshals as Captain Matthews, ready to arrest Garrison the moment he produced the falsified documents needed to complete his fraudulent land purchases. There are risks, Jake admitted, his concern for his father's safety evident despite his professional demeanor. If Garrison realizes what's happening before the marshals can act, he might try to eliminate witnesses. You'd be in real danger. Gus looked around at the faces surrounding him, his son, grown into a man of honor and courage, Joseph running bare, keeper of ancient wisdom and modern justice, Jensen, a former criminal seeking redemption, and Bradley, a methodical investigator who'd spent years patiently building an unshakable case. For 23 years, he'd carried the weight of grief and guilt, believing that his family had been destroyed by random tragedy beyond anyone's control. Now he understood that their suffering had been deliberately inflicted by a man who'd exploited trust and friendship to cover unspeakable crimes. The wedding ring on his finger caught the late afternoon sunlight, and for the first time in decades, it felt like a symbol of love rather than loss. Martha's investigation had made this moment possible, and Jake's survival had given it meaning beyond simple revenge. "I've spent 23 years wishing I could have protected my family," Gus said, his voice carrying the quiet determination of a man who'd finally found his purpose. "Now I have the chance to make sure Garrison never destroys another family the way he destroyed ours." Scout the Eagle spread her wings and took flight, circling the amphitheater once before, heading toward the darkening eastern horizon. Her work as messenger was nearly complete, but tomorrow would determine whether the message she'd carried would result in justice or tragedy. As the sun set behind the red mesas that had watched over his land for millions of years, Augustus Maddox felt something he hadn't experienced since that terrible day when Jake's bed had been found empty. He felt like a father again, ready to fight for his son's future and his wife's memory with everything he had left to give. The final battle would be fought not with guns in remote canyons, but with law and evidence in the halls of territorial government. But it would be a battle nonetheless, and Gus intended to see that justice finally prevailed. The Santa Fe Territorial Land Office buzzed with the controlled energy of men conducting business that would reshape the future of New Mexico territory. Ranchers, speculators, and territorial officials filled the high-ceilinged room, their voices creating a steady hum of negotiation and calculation that echoed off adobe walls thick enough to muffle gunshots. Outside, the morning sun painted the ancient city in shades of gold and red that had witnessed centuries of conquest and commerce. Gus sat in the back row of wooden chairs, his posture carefully crafted to project defeat and desperation. His best suit hung loose on his frame weight he'd lost during the sleepless weeks since discovering the truth about Jake's disappearance, and his weathered hands trembled just enough to suggest a man at the end of his resources. The performance required every acting skill he'd never known he possessed, because one wrong gesture, one moment of confidence showing through his facade, could doom the entire operation. Theodore Garrison occupied the front row with the casual arrogance of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted through a combination of legal maneuvering and carefully applied intimidation. At 65, he'd maintained the distinguished appearance that had served him so well in territorial legal circles: silver hair, perfectly groomed, expensive suit tailored to hide the soft flesh of a man who'd grown wealthy while others did the hard work. His leather briefcase sat on the floor beside his chair, containing what Jake's intelligence network had identified as falsified financial documents and forged mineral rights certificates worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Positioned throughout the room were federal marshals disguised as ordinary auction participants. Jake Captain Matthews stood near the territorial surveyor's table, his military bearings slightly softened to blend with the civilian crowd, but his hand never far from the service revolver hidden beneath his coat. The legal evidence cache that would seal Garrison's fate sat in a reinforced strongbox behind the land commissioner's desk, containing 5 years' worth of meticulously documented crimes. The auctioneer called the morning session to order, his gavel echoing sharply through the crowded room. First item for consideration today is the Morrison Ranch Holdings, 15,000 acres of prime grazing land with established water rights and potential mineral deposits. Opening bid will be $15,000. Garrison's hand went up immediately, his bid delivered with the confidence of a man who'd never lost an auction in his life. But as the bidding progressed, Gus watched something he'd never seen before creep into the lawyer's expression: uncertainty. Other bidders were driving the price higher than expected, forcing Garrison to reach deeper into his fraudulent financial reserves than he'd planned. 22,000, called a rancher from Las Cruces. 25,000, Garrison responded, his voice carrying the first hint of strain. 30,000, came a new voice from the back of the room. Every head turned toward the speaker, and Gus felt his heart nearly stop as he recognized the voice that had haunted his dreams for 23 years. But it wasn't Garrison who'd spoken, it was someone who shouldn't have been there at all. Standing in the doorway, dressed in travel-stained clothing and wearing an expression of grim determination, was Martha. Not Martha as she'd been when she died, wasted away by poison and grief, but Martha as she'd looked in the early years of their marriage, strong, vibrant, and very much alive. The woman Gus had mourned for 4 years was walking into the land office like someone returning from a long but not permanent journey. The room fell silent as she made her way toward the front, her presence commanding attention in a way that transcended mere surprise. Garrison's face had gone pale as bleached bone, his confident demeanor cracking like poorly mortared adobe in an earthquake. "Martha Maddox," she announced clearly, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent years preparing for this moment. "And I'm here to contest the sale of any property previously owned by the Maddox family, on the grounds that the original land transfers were completed under fraudulent circumstances." She moved toward the land commissioner's desk with documents of her own, not the yellowed papers of someone long dead, but fresh legal filings that bore official territorial seals. "I have here sworn depositions detailing 23 years of systematic fraud perpetrated by Theodore Garrison, including the forged transfer of mineral rights, the falsified documentation of my own death, and the kidnapping of my 6-year-old son." Garrison finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a croak. "That's impossible. You're dead. I attended your funeral." Martha's smile carried the cold satisfaction of a trap finally sprung. "You attended the funeral of Margaret Eustace, a consumptive woman from the Territorial Sanitarium who died the same week you thought you'd poisoned me successfully. The switch was arranged by federal investigators who'd been building a case against you for years." Jake stepped forward from his position near the surveyor's table, his military bearing now unmistakable. "Mrs. Maddox has been living under federal protection in Denver, providing testimony and evidence that forms the foundation of multiple indictment warrants." The federal marshals moved simultaneously, surrounding Garrison before he could process what was happening. But the lawyer's legal mind was already working, searching for escape routes and procedural delays that might save him. "This is entrapment," he declared, his voice regaining some of its courtroom authority. "Any evidence gathered through deception will be inadmissible in territorial court." "That's why we're not relying on territorial court," Jake replied, producing a set of documents that bore federal seals. "Theodore Garrison, you're under arrest for mail fraud, conspiracy to commit murder, kidnapping, and violations of federal mining regulations across territorial boundaries. These crimes fall under federal jurisdiction." As the handcuffs clicked around Garrison's wrists, Gus sat in stunned silence, watching his world reshape itself around truths he'd never dared to hope for. Martha was alive. Jake was alive and had grown into a man of honor and courage, and the man who'd destroyed their family was finally facing justice for his crimes. The handcuffs seemed to awaken something desperate and dangerous in Theodore Garrison. His face contorted with rage as he realized the scope of the deception that had been orchestrated around him, and when he spoke, his voice carried the venom of a cornered rattlesnake. "You sanctimonious fools think you've won something here," he snarled, struggling against the federal marshals who held him. "Do you have any idea how far this network extends? How many territorial officials owe their positions to my influence? I'll be free within a week, and then you'll face additional charges for threatening federal witnesses," Jake interrupted, his military training keeping his voice level despite the personal satisfaction of seeing his family's tormentor finally in custody. But Garrison wasn't finished. His lawyer's mind had been working through possibilities, even as the trap closed around him, and now he played what he clearly believed was his final card. "The boy saw something that day in the canyon," he said, his eyes fixed on Jake with malicious triumph. "Something that will destroy this precious federal case if it ever comes to light. Did you tell them about the other bodies, Jacob? The ones hidden where the Apache girl was found?" A ripple of tension went through the federal marshals, and Gus felt his blood turn to ice. Even now, even in defeat, Garrison was trying to twist the truth into a weapon that could wound his enemies. Jake's expression didn't change, but Martha stepped forward with the measured precision of someone who'd spent years preparing for exactly this moment. "We've already found them," she said calmly, reaching into her traveling bag and withdrawing a small object that made Garrison's face go white with shock. It was Martha's wedding ring, the simple gold band that Gus had watched her twist around her finger during moments of deep thought, the ring he'd placed in what he'd believed was her coffin 4 years ago. "The ring I wore during my supposed final illness was a duplicate," Martha explained, holding up the original. "This one contains something special, a hidden compartment that your associate Carl Jensen helped us design 3 years ago when he decided to turn against you." She twisted the band in a way that opened a tiny cavity within the gold, revealing a space just large enough to hold a small roll of paper. "Every conversation you had in my presence during those final months was recorded in shorthand and hidden in this ring, including your confession about the children you murdered to protect your mining operations." The paper she extracted was covered in Martha's precise shorthand notation, a skill she'd learned as a young woman when she'd briefly worked as a court reporter before her marriage. As she unrolled it, the cramped symbols became readable testimony that would seal Garrison's fate. "The Apache girl was getting too close to the silver deposits," Martha read aloud. "Had to make it look like an accident, but that boy saw too much. Can't risk him talking to his father about what he witnessed." "That's what you said to Jensen the day after Jake disappeared, Theodore, word for word." Garrison's composure finally cracked completely. "You can't use that. Conversations between attorney and client are privileged. But conversations between conspirators planning additional murders aren't," Jake pointed out, "and Jensen has already testified that he was never your client, just an employee you were instructing in criminal activities." The final piece of evidence came from the Territorial Land Commissioner himself, a thin man named Morrison, who'd been quietly observing the proceedings with the careful attention of someone who understood that his own career might depend on how this moment unfolded. "I've been reviewing the mineral surveys that Mr. Garrison submitted for today's auction," Morrison announced, holding up a folder thick with documents. "These claims show mining activity on the disputed properties dating back 15 years, but they're signed by territorial surveyors who didn't even work for the territory during those time periods. The forgeries had been expertly done, but like all lies, they'd contained internal contradictions that careful examination could expose. Jake had been counting on Garrison's arrogance to lead him into submitting the falsified surveys as evidence, the final piece of proof needed to demonstrate the systematic nature of his crimes. Furthermore," Morrison continued, "these surveys show mineral extractions from sacred Apache burial sites, which violates federal treaty obligations and constitutes desecration of protected tribal lands." That revelation brought Joseph running bare forward from where he'd been standing near the back of the room. The elderly Apache leader's presence added weight to charges that now extended beyond simple fraud into violations of federal Indian policy. "My people have been documenting the desecration of our sacred sites for 20 years, Joseph said, his voice carrying the authority of age and righteous anger. "We have photographs, witness testimony, and physical evidence of illegal mining operations on lands protected by federal treaty." Garrison seemed to shrink in his restraints as the full scope of the case against him became clear. Federal marshals, territorial officials, and Apache tribal representatives, his crimes had crossed so many jurisdictional lines that escape was impossible. Martha approached Gus, who had remained seated throughout the confrontation, still struggling to process the miracle of her presence. She held out her hand, the hand wearing the original wedding ring that had helped gather the evidence to destroy their family's enemy. "Hello, husband," she said softly, her voice carrying all the love that 4 years of separation hadn't been able to diminish. "I've missed you more than words can say." As Gus rose to embrace the wife he'd mourned and the son he'd never stopped loving, Theodore Garrison was led away in shackles, His empire of deception finally collapsed under the weight of truth that had taken 23 years to fully emerge. 6 months after the federal trial that had sent Theodore Garrison to prison for the remainder of his natural life, the Maddox Ranch had been transformed from a monument to grief into something it hadn't been for over 2 decades, a true home where laughter echoed through rooms that had known too much sorrow for too long. The morning sun painted familiar patterns across the wraparound porch where Gus sat with his coffee, but everything else had changed in ways that still amazed him when he stopped to consider the miracle of it all. Martha occupied her old chair beside him, her hair now showing silver threads that hadn't been there during her years in federal protection, but her eyes bright with the contentment of someone who'd seen justice finally served. The lines that grief and poison had carved into her face were gradually softening, replaced by the gentle marks of genuine happiness. Jake Captain Matthews was still his legal name, though he'd requested transfer to territorial assignments that would keep him closer to New Mexico, stood at the porch rail, holding a cup of Miguel's excellent coffee and watching the sunrise paint the mesas in shades of gold and crimson. At 32, he carried himself with the confident bearing of a man who'd found his purpose in life, but Gus could see echoes of the curious 6-year-old who'd once peppered him with endless questions about everything from cloud formations to cattle breeding. The territorial governor wants to officially reinstate your mineral rights to all the land Garrison stole, Jake said, turning from his contemplation of the morning landscape. Full compensation for 20 years of illegal extraction, plus damages for the environmental destruction of the sacred sites. Joseph should handle that negotiation, Martha replied, her voice carrying the practical wisdom that had made her such an effective partner in building their original ranching empire. His people understand the true value of what was taken, and they know how to ensure it never happens again. The baby Eagle Scout perched on her usual spot on the porch rail, though her role as messenger between worlds had evolved into something more companionable. She'd become the ranch's unofficial guardian, keeping watch over the family that her training had helped reunite. Occasionally she'd take flight toward the canyon country, but she always returned by evening, as if understanding that her most important work was simply being present as a symbol of hope fulfilled. Miguel emerged from the kitchen carrying a plate of fresh biscuits and the satisfied expression of a man who'd seen his faith in family loyalty finally rewarded. At 68, he moved with the careful precision of someone who'd earned the right to take his time, but his eyes still held the sharp awareness that had made him such a valuable judge of character over the years. "The new hands are settling in well," he reported, settling into a chair that had been added to accommodate the ranch's expanded family circle. "Young Peterson has a good eye for cattle, and Martinez knows horses better than most men know their own wives." The ranch was thriving again. Word had spread through the territory about the Maddox family's resurrection and Garrison's downfall, attracting honest workers who wanted to be part of something clean and legitimate after years of wondering which operations they could trust. The herds were growing, the buildings had been repaired and expanded, and for the first time in decades, the bunkhouse rang with the voices of men who could sleep soundly, knowing they were working for people who valued integrity over easy profit. "I've been thinking about that wooden horse," Jake said suddenly, his voice carrying a note of nostalgia that reminded Gus that despite everything his son had accomplished, part of him would always be that 6-year-old boy who'd treasured a carved toy. "The one I was carrying when they took me. Do you think it's still at the bottom of Devil's Drop? We could ride out there and look for it," Gus suggested, surprised by his own willingness to revisit a place that had haunted his dreams for so many years. "Might be good to face that place together, as a family." Martha reached over and took his weathered hand in hers, the wedding ring that had helped bring down their enemy now restored to its rightful place. "I think that's exactly what we should do. Transform a place of sorrow into something that holds hope for the future." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. A rider appeared on the horizon, making his way up the long drive that led to the ranch house. As he drew closer, Gus recognized Tom Bradley, the private investigator who'd helped orchestrate their family's reunion. Bradley dismounted and approached the porch with the satisfied expression of a man bearing good news. "Thought you'd want to know the territorial court just finished reviewing all of Garrison's old cases. They've identified 47 separate instances of fraud, forgery, and illegal land transfers. The families affected will be getting their property back, along with compensation for damages." "And the children?" Martha asked, her voice heavy with the weight of losses that couldn't be restored. 8 families confirmed that their missing children were victims of Garrison's operations. "There won't be any reunions like yours, but at least they'll finally have answers about what happened to their little ones. The Apache Nation is planning a memorial service for Morning Star, and the others, Joseph Running Bear, asked if you'd attend as honored guests." Jake nodded solemnly. "Of course. We owe those children and their families a debt that can never be fully repaid." As Bradley departed with promises to keep them informed about the ongoing investigations, the family settled into comfortable silence, watching the sun climb higher over land that had finally been cleansed of the corruption that had poisoned it for so many years. Scout spread her wings and took flight, circling the house once before, heading toward the canyon country where she'd first learned to carry messages of hope. But this time, she wasn't leading anyone anywhere. She was simply celebrating the freedom that came with a mission completed and a purpose fulfilled. In the distance, cattle grazed peacefully on grass that grew green and rich without the shadow of illegal mining operations. The mesas stood eternal and unchanging, their ancient faces holding secrets that belonged to the earth itself, rather than to men who would exploit them for profit. And on the porch of the ranch house, where 3 generations of Maddoxes had watched the sunrise, a family sat together in contentment, their bonds strengthened by trials that had tested them beyond endurance, but failed to break the love that connected them across time, distance, and even apparent death. The new family photograph that would soon join the others on Martha's mantelpiece would show 3 people and 1 eagle, all of them together at last, all of them home.